Hello, and thanks for joining our webinar. I am Randy Sainer, a Beef Systems Extension Educator at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Today is part of our Center for Ag Profitability's weekly webinar series, which usually happens every Thursday at noon. Check out the full schedule on the website at cap.unl.edu. Given persistent drought conditions across much of Nebraska, cow-calf producers in the state may be considering early weaning of their calves. This webinar will present strategies for preconditioning those calves to help the weaning process go more smoothly, including feeding practices, vaccinations, and other elements to consider prior to weaning. Joining me to present, we have Lindsay Waechter-Mead, a beef educator with Nebraska Extension. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, Randy.
We are also joined by Travis Mulliniks, Associate Professor in Range Cow Production Systems here at UNL. Hi, Travis, and Travis will be our first speaker.
Hey, Randy.
So, Travis, if you want to go ahead, I think we're ready for you.
All right. All right, thanks for having me today, Randy, and thanks everybody for jumping on and being with us today. So going to give a short presentation on preconditioning calves. Hopefully it will be beneficial to everyone that's on here. So when we think about preconditioning, we think about the management steps prior to, during, and after weaning that ensures optimal health and performance of those calves once they leave the ranch. And so there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of different management strategies around preconditioning, and it's not a one-size-fits-all program. And so we'll cover a little bit of that today from my side aspect of the management side of managing calves after that or around that weaning time point. And so when we think about preconditioning steps, there's like I said, there's some pre-weaning and around weaning time, and there's post-weaning steps. And so when we think about preconditioning from a pre-weaning time, we've got the dams, pre-calving nutrition. We've got mineral supplementation for the dam and that calf. There's deworming, there's vaccinations, which Lindsay will talk about, castration and dehorning. And from the post-weaning, which mostly what we'll focus with today for my presentation is how do we manage stress of weaning? And that's a big one of preconditioning, is just the management of that, the stress around that really stressful time of weaning. Training calves to eat from a bunk is a big one. Well-balanced nutrition program to achieve positive gain. And then we really focused on a minimum of roughly a 45-day weaning period. And I'll show you some data why that's important here shortly. So like I mentioned, our practices really are focused on how to reduce stress around that weaning time. And this is really important from the aspect of sickness and health of that calf and the immune function of that calf once it leaves the ranch. And so one thing that we want to do is during that weaning time is provide a familiar, a clean environment for that calf. And when I say clean, it could be in a dry lot pen, but that it's not muddy, it's cleared away, it doesn't have a lot of trash in it, but it's a familiar environment for that calf. Weaning method all depends, and so not any weaning method is better than another one. It just the stress around that weaning or how you do it to decrease the stress is important, whether or not it's a complete separation in a dry lot or a fence line weaning situation. In both situations, I've seen train wrecks in both situations of a complete separation or a fence line. And really, it's what fits best to your operation and your facilities to decrease the stress of that calf. From a nutritional option, one strategy does not fit all. And so feeding programs really begin at the time of weaning. And so that's really important that as soon as we wean those calves, we get them on feed and they're eating as soon as possible. And from a preconditioning time frame, we think about the nutritional program accounting for 50 to 70% of that preconditioning budget. So that's a huge part of preconditioning cost is associated with the nutritional program. And so depending on the outcome that you want and the economics of it is, you may want to balance that with not necessarily increasing gain, but how can I do it at a low cost that can increase the health aspect and get through that weaning time frame of that calf through that stressful time frame. And so earlier I mentioned that a 45-day is generally thought about being the optimal time frame from a preconditioning time span. And some of this data comes from this data here. This is some older data from the New Mexico Ranch to Rail program. And so what they found with preconditioning calves, and this is net returns from the feedlot, but this is how many days from weaning until those calves hit the feedlot. And so this first bar here is 0 to 20 days. The second bar is 21 days to 40 days. Then we got 41 to 60 and 61 plus days of that preconditioning time frame. And as we increased up to above 40 days, we saw, or they saw, positive return from preconditioning. Anything less than, that's still a negative return. And there's multiple reasons for this, but this really kind of set up the standard or some of the original data that set up the standard for the original VAC 45-day program. So when we think about a preconditioning method, if we preconditioning, we've got a couple different options from a ranch side. We've got pasture preconditioning, and so this, for a lot of producers, this is highly utilized that don't have the dry lot space to wean calves or preconditioned calves. And so the benefits of pasture preconditioning would be it's a less environmental change. And so what we tend to see sometimes these calves coming from, so especially from extensive environments, is you put them in a pen for the first time and they actually walk a lot, expend more energy being locked up in that pen versus being out on the range. And so it's, for some calves, it's less stressful because it's not a very big change in their environment. It's less dietary change. You have less mud, dust control is required, but you often have less gain, and often you don't have the ability to train to eat at a bunk. From a dry lot preconditioning, you can have increased gain. You have the ability to train them to eat from a bunk. It is a bigger change in environment, and you also have some dust or mud control that's needed. And so not one method is better than the other. It really depends on your facilities and your ability to precondition and hold those calves in a less stressful manner. This is some older data that I was part of when I was in grad school, but when we think about the differences in dry lot preconditioning or pasture preconditioning, really the results for performance are not any different. And so in this study, we had calves that we dry lotted, weaned and dry lotted through that preconditioning time frame. And then we had some calves that we pasture preconditioned in 1,000-acre pastures. And from a performance standpoint, there's not a huge difference in performance, especially when they went to the feedlot. The big difference here is cost. And so that's the big thing to take into account a preconditioning program. That one is not necessarily better than the other in performance, but how do I control my cost to that preconditioning that may be a little more profitable than the other method? And it really determines on your cost of gain or your situation with your facilities. Another component, or the biggest component of preconditioning, is health. And this is really why we should precondition or think about preconditioning calves, is the impact that preconditioning has on subsequent feedlot morbidity or health aspect during the feedlot. And this is 3 different studies from South Dakota, Colorado, and Oklahoma on preconditioned calves in the blue and non-preconditioned calves in the red. And so the data set from South Dakota really didn't show any difference in morbidity percentage, but in the Colorado and Oklahoma data sets, really a huge difference in the response of preconditioning. And so that's, when we think about the impact of preconditioning, it's really not necessarily from a performance aspect of when they're in the feedlot, but it's more from, am I setting them up to handle the stress of being shipped, received at the feedlot, and to perform well from then on. And it's really that stress that we're trying to control or minimize. This is a similar study that was done at Oklahoma State that looked at receiving health by weaning program. And so we've got market bought calves here. We've got calves that were just shipped off the cow. We've got calves that were in a preconditioning for 45 days that were weaned without any vaccination. And then we have our VAC 45-day program here on the far right. And we look at morbidity across those. The big response is in the market bought calves and the calves that were just shipped off the cow. At very similar morbidity, when we look at our 45 or our preconditioning programs, a similar morbidity response across the two. We look at percent treated in the feedlot between these, same responses. The market in the calves that were shipped directly off the cow at weaning time, that was not what was weaned on the trailer, had similar health responses versus the preconditioning calves had a much lower percent treated for sickness. And so this is the big impact that we're going to see in preconditioning, is we're setting those calves up better, handle that stress receiving and through that early phase of being in the feedlot. So in summary, I think about preconditioning as preparing calves for challenges once they leave the ranch. And so we're optimizing that health and potentially that performance, because if there's a big health response or negative response on health, we will see a decrease in average daily gain in those calves in the feedlot. So you can see a decrease in performance, but really we're preparing those calves for the challenges once they leave the ranch. And so our largest impact will be on health. We do have some variable responses to feedlot performance from average daily gain, but that's really going to be driving by the variation in health response. And the economics of it is, it really depends on the marketing and your cost of preconditioning. And so if I'm selling calves at a sale barn that are preconditioned, I may not get the benefit if I'm like I would if I'm marketing those calves, the preconditioning calves, to a feedlot or through another avenue that would gain that value-added program of a precondition. And so that's very important to think about. If I'm preconditioned, and how am I going to market these calves to actually gain that benefit of that preconditioning? So with any of that, I will turn this over to Lindsay, and we can take questions later.
Okay. So a lot of this you're going to see is going to be just emphasizing what Travis already talked about. And I'm going to talk about how we can kind of minimize those calf risks. We're going to hone in on that discussion. But obviously, like Travis had mentioned, our number one goal at any time we're dealing with cattle is going to be to minimize stress, especially at weaning or preconditioning. So these are a lot of different bullet points that we'll go over, and a lot of them Travis already talked about. And I'll end with talking about some vaccinations, but again, the low stress handling and some weaning options. So if you are fortunate to have the space and you can do fence line weaning where you just take away the baby, but they can still see mom, that really helps. But the other thing is about the how you handle those calves. So definitely talking about, we go from the thought of driving and pushing calves to thinking more about how that calf can lead its way through and actually, move in a low stress manner. It also involves making sure that your pens and your facilities are easy to operate, and they're, it keeps those calves calm the most we can, always just having that calm demeanor around them. Obviously, nutritional management is a big part of minimizing stress in a calf's life. That starts all the way back to the cow, making sure she's in good condition so that she's been milking properly. But also if they have had access to creep or how their pasture range is looking, those are really important. And then thinking into when we get them home, or if we're taking them to a lot, or we're going to go ahead and wean them on the pasture, what do we have available for those calves? Is it highly palatable? Will they find it easy? Can they get to the bunk? Okay, those are all really important things to consider. Another soapbox that I stand on a little bit is about processing calves. So Travis had mentioned during preconditioning, if we need to do something like castrating or dehorning. As a veterinarian, I always recommend that we do these as early in life as possible, but I understand there may be some bull calves that didn't make the cut, or we're wanting to do it at this time now that we are taking them off of grass. But it's really important to remember that any sort of high pain, whatever we're doing to the calves, especially the castrating and dehorning at weaning time, when those calves are the most stressed they'll be in their life, is just going to set them up for a wreck. And so the day that you pull those calves off the cow is not the day to be cutting them. Definitely want to pre-plan and think about possibly doing that in the preconditioning period. So giving those calves at least a 2-week window buffer, 2 to 3 weeks, where they're still with mom. If you do have to cut them, they can go back and try to manage some of that pain that's happening to them, but then they still are in a familiar place and they're still with mom, and they can get through that without the extra stress that's needed. The next one is parasite control. We know that this is important, especially external parasites at this time of year. Flies can be a really stressful event for calves, stomping and swishing and trying to get themselves away from those irritants. Not only is it annoying, it's stressful, but they're wasting a lot of energy doing that, and it can lead to some health effects. So, use whatever product you're familiar with and that is working for you. Just make sure that you keep that in mind, that you are on top of the fly control for those guys. Travis talked about the environmental stress that can come in, and definitely in August, we've had multiple days in a row where we have 100+ degree. We're in a drought, we know this, and so it's dusty and it's hot. If you are working calves, make sure that you're trying to pick the cooler times of the day, so early in the morning or late at night. Not only is that for the stress of the calf, but it's also for you and your crew. We want to make sure that we are aware of what the environment is doing and try to work with it the best that we can. And then finally, health plans. That definitely, this is an important part of managing the stress of a calf's life. Those include vaccination protocols and treatment plans, and we're going to touch on those here for just a little bit. So I wanted to just briefly go through the principles of vaccination before we talk about what protocols to use. It's really important to understand how vaccines work, and just to remember a few facts when you're using them. The point of a vaccination is to minimize risk. So we know something is out there that's going to affect our calf's life for health. Whatever pathogen affects your herd normally, that would be what you're looking to prevent by getting a vaccination. But it's important to remember that not all vaccinations provide 100% protection. And this is multifaceted, and a lot of people have asked me, why isn't it 100%? Vaccines are produced they're in controlled environments when they're doing studies, and they have to meet a certain percentage, but none of them are going to be a 100% slam dunk. And another reason is because some of these calves are not going to respond the same as another calf may possibly will. So one calf may get a better immune response than another one. And even in between herds are going to, yours might be different than your neighbors. And so that's an important concept to remember too, when you're using a vaccination. And then thirdly, it takes time to build up the immunity. So, the day that you give a vaccine they're not going to be immediately protected from something in the environment. So this is why we recommend giving multiple doses of vaccinations. Ideally, we did this at branding or in the spring before grass turnout, where they got their first exposure to a vaccination. And then we come back again at preconditioning prior to weaning at at least a 2-week window buffer where they're still with mom and their stress levels are low, and we're going to booster that vaccine. And what that's going to do is it's going to tell that calf's immune system, hey, this is something foreign. I see this antigen. I need to start building up my immune system, build my army to fight off anything if I ever see this again. So that's why we do multiple doses of the vaccine, and then their immunity will just grow from there. That's why it's important to remember, they won't get it. They aren't immune the day that you give it immediately. And then finally, just always make sure that you're following all the label directions on vaccines. They are not inexpensive. I respect that. But if you follow the directions and handle them properly, you're gonna definitely get what they're worth. If you're not following those directions, there's a potential that the entire vaccine is not going to even work for you. One example would be if you're using a modified live vaccine, and this is when those are the 2 vaccine vials that you mix together. Once those are mixed, they're actually only good for a short period of time. My rule of thumb is usually 1 hour, whatever calves I can work within 1 hour, that's the amount of vaccine I will mix up. It's also important to remember Bqa guidelines when you're vaccinating. So keep it out of the sun, keep it in a cooler, make sure your syringe is clean and your needle is clean and not bent, and you have the right gauge. And then also we're giving those vaccinations in the neck subcutaneously so that we're following the Bqa guidelines and we're getting the most out of that vaccination so the calf can respond appropriately. So when and what? When do we give this vaccination? So there's a couple things that are really important to remember. There is a hormone called cortisol, and cortisol elevates when you're stressed, people, animals alike. So cortisol levels, we know that if they are high, then we're going to have your immune system be suppressed. So that decreases the response that they have. So these calves that if you ran your calves to try and catch them and you're pulling them off of mom and you're hauling them 10 miles down the road and then you're running them through a chute and it's loud and you go to give them a vaccine the same time, their cortisol levels are through the roof. And so their immune system is just, think of it like it's just trying to keep that calf going. So it doesn't even recognize the fact that you just gave it this vaccine and, oh, now I have to try and fight that too. So definitely the day of weaning is not the time to give a vaccine. Again, we want to go before, so you want to pre-plan before your weaning day to give the preconditioning vaccinations. 2 to 3 week window is good. You get that buffer. And then wherever you're taking them, if you're taking them home or you're leaving them on pasture after the initial weaning event, we want to give another couple weeks buffer so that these calves can get acclimated to the bunk. They're able to eat. They know where the water's at, and then they get over losing mom. And then we're going to go back and booster it again. So you're just keeping that stress level in mind, that we want to keep those cortisol levels down. This graph along the side here, it kind of gives you a visual of what I just said, but you can see the dark black, the immediate plateau, that's your passive immunity. And that's the antibodies that calf is going to get from mom in the colostrum. So it peaks at birth, it gets a good meal, it's getting some great colostrum right after that, and it builds up the immune system that it needs. Then you can see this slower gradual peak coming up that's light gray. That's the active immunity, and that's what the calf has gotten by vaccinations or exposure to different pathogens. So it's slowly building it up. But the key is this little area right here called the window of susceptibility. All that means is passive immunity is starting to go down because that from mom doesn't stay forever. And then the active immunity is trying to build up. But there is an area where it's a little weak, a little weak there. And so this is where calves, if you see it really correlates right around weaning time. So again, if our immune system isn't quite where it needs to be, and we're stressing our calves out right at weaning, we've got so many things going on and happening to that calf that it might not, it's not going to respond to the vaccine that we need, and we're not going to get the money out of it, and we're not going to get that calf protected. So keep that in mind when you're considering timing. And then what vaccine do you want to use? And I get asked this question all the time. Well, I'll show you a few protocols based on a couple studies, but really it just depends on what you like, what your veterinarian recommends, that you have got together as a team and you've discussed your goals, what pathogens are in your area. So what are you trying to prevent? And really, what company do you like working with? Honestly, we're fortunate that there's several different options on the market. Which ones have worked what best for you and your veterinarian, and which one fits your plan the greatest. So as far as talking about protocols, I always like to go back to this. This is the American Association of Bovine Practitioners. They put out some vaccination guidelines in 2021. And they're calling them core vaccines. So these 4 that are here, this will be your 5-way viral vaccine. So it's the BVD 1 and 2, IBR, PI3, and BRSV. These are the big guns of the viral vaccines. And then they also recommend a Clostridial vaccine. That's your 7-way or your blackleg vaccine. That's included in a core. So every bovine should have this vaccine, these vaccines. There's not anything that's black and white cookie cutter. Every producer is going to have different goals and they're going to be exposed to different things. And so, working with your veterinarian and setting up which exact protocol you need is the most important. But these are, in the majority of the group, this would be considered core vaccines that these calves need to have at this time. And then just kind of solidifying that fact, there was a study that went out in 2017 where they surveyed veterinarians from across the United States and Canada, and they asked them, what vaccines do you commonly recommend to your cow-calf producers at pre-weaning, so preconditioning time? And 93% and above are saying they're recommending that 5-way viral vaccine. 88% recommended a Clostridial or the 7-way vaccine. So it just falls in line with the core vaccine recommendations from AABP. And then I would just add, again, talking to your veterinarian and setting up your plans. There may be some bacterial that you want to add into that too, such as Mannheimia or Histophilus, just based on, again, what you've been exposed to. So once you set up that protocol, based on your goals and what those calves might be exposed to, then we can make sure that we have the right health plans for these calves. So why do we precondition? And Travis talked a lot on the reasoning behind the 45 days. And honestly, I think that it comes back to an animal welfare issue. He had mentioned that before. We're really talking about the health. So we know that we have, as a cow-calf producer, we have worked really hard. We consider genetics and we set up a breeding plan and we go through the long nights of calving and we baby these guys and we get them to where they need to be. And it's only fitting that we continue them, because their ultimate goal and our ultimate goal as cattle producers is to feed the world. So we're trying to take these from calf to harvest, from birth to harvest. And so making sure that they are set up to be as healthy as they can during that high stress event. We're just trying to maintain that health throughout. Once it gets into the feeding period, this is older data too, but this is, again, the same stuff that Travis had talked about. They had 3 different groups of calves, one that had no vaccines and then a couple of different ones. And you can see that the morbidity of the calves that had never had a vaccine was up to 42% from arrival to harvest versus 15% of the vaccine. So we're setting up that healthy, to get that calf healthy as it goes into that high stress environment of getting to the feed yard. And we're also trying to maximize feed efficiency. We know that calves that are more sick, that have to be pulled or treated more often, are going to have a lower average daily gain. We also know that calves that aren't preconditioned definitely suffer from that. So we're losing some of that feed efficiency. And when feed costs are very high, that kind of takes a bite too. And then, of course, treatment costs are going to be involved. And this is all on the, depending on how long you're retaining these calves. But every time you have to, treat a calf or pull a calf for being sick, it's definitely going to increase the cost. But on our end, as a cow-calf producer, the 2 big things about why we precondition, definitely you should be getting a premium. You should be marketing these calves that, they have been bunk broke and they are not bawling and they know how to eat and they're doing well and they got over that high stress period of weaning. But also I believe reputation does play a role in it. And I know that you don't get paid on reputation, but you do get paid if you get repetition. So year after year of selling your calves and knowing that you worked really hard to get those calves to that point, that you can just consistently bring a calf crop to the market that you're proud of and that others are proud of as well. So in summary, it's definitely important to plan ahead. This isn't something where we don't want to just pull calves off and try and vaccinate them that day. We want to do it beforehand. And especially now, if you're looking at some stressed out pastures, then, now is a good time to start thinking about preconditioning, getting those calves ready to go. Talk to your veterinarian, establish the protocols that you need so that you guys are on the same page and you know what you need to use and based on your retention plans. And always, Travis talked about it too, but whatever you're doing, you're just trying to minimize the stressful event in that calf's life. So always keep that in the back of your mind when you're doing something. And then remember the goal. We're trying to raise these calves to take them from birth to harvest. And so we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to set that calf up to be successful. With that, that's my contact information. I'll stop sharing and I'll let Randy finish up here.
Thanks, Lindsay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about economics. I'm a beef educator and talk a little bit about some things to think about. And so, we're seeing a lot of drought in our area. And one thing you can do by weaning early is save about 4/10 a day for forage for cows, almost a half a day. So by getting those calves weaned, you can actually extend your forage that you have available. In some areas, we don't even have forage available. So this is the drought map. You can see Nebraska. There's a lot of red here in my area in the Southwest region. I'm getting a lot of calls on early weaning and things we can do to save on forage. So if we look at a premium vac 45 versus non-vaccinated, and we look at premiums for sales. This is Superior Livestock Auction, where they looked at calves that were sold like this. You can see that there is a premium there. The big thing is we need to get a budget to know what our cost is and to see if it's going to actually pay for itself. And again, reputation, like Lindsay said, over time, you may get a higher premium, but selling in a pre-vac sale or making sure that at the sell barn, they know that you've done this work is going to be important, because this is the kind of, and this was done early in 2000s, 95, 2000, there's more work past that. But also, if you look here at, this is the premium associated with preconditioned calves in dollars per pound or total dollars. Right here in the lighter blue thing, you can see anywhere from $30 to $49. Now, here's what I'll say is, feed cost today, it might take you $74 to feed that calf. So is it a gaining deal? Maybe not, but if your calves are small, we have some calves that sold in the Cook and Imperial. They brought $789 a head. They weigh 290 pounds. So can you afford to take that price, or do you have to put a little bit more on them, which the feeder is probably going to pay a little bit more because you backgrounded them and done the right thing. So those are things you want to consider, but look at the budget, try to see what you have for feed available. And we know that feeding that calf is going to be more efficient than trying to feed that cow on range and she's given milk is not the most efficient way to do it, because a dry cow eats less forage. and the calf is going to be more efficient with the feed. This just looks at, this is Texas A&M program, and for every 1% change in percent sickness in the feedlot, it resulted in 92 cents per head change in net revenue. So they gain 92 cents for every 1% reduction in sickness. So you can see for the feedlot, it really does pay. And that's why in some cases, they're going to want to give you a premium. Also, if you're doing your own backgrounding, it's going to benefit you by, preconditioning these calves before you wean, so you don't have sickness also. This just looks at carcass quality grades, and you can see that those sick calves had more select and also more standard calves, which is a lower price, a lower quality product that we're trying to avoid in our industry. This is just the effect of added value health programs, the VAC 45, the 34, and the non-certified. And you can see that the VAC 45 has the better premiums because that 45-day period really is important, like Travis showed earlier, in making sure those calves are healthy before they go to feedlot. This just looks at degree of vaccination. So you can see that there was 0 times vaccinated 1, 2, and 3. And you can see that maternal separation, of course, they're all about the same. Shipping, you can see that the weight's pretty much the same. But if you look at preconditioned average daily gain, we went from 0.6 to 0.65 for those that were treated 3 times. Dry matter intake was better for those calves that were vaccinated properly, and gain to feed was improved for those calves that had a good vaccination program. Also, morbidity was a little bit more reduced with the vaccination programs. That's pretty much what I have. I guess we're open for questions now. So if we'd like to take any questions, feel free to ask them at this time. Put them in the box.
Lindsay, if I'm castrating late around weaning time, is there any benefits of getting meloxicam at that point to help with that stress and the loss in average daily gain you're going to get?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, honestly, regardless of when you're castrating, I think giving meloxicam is a good idea. Again, talk to your veterinarian about what you would like to use, but you're going to see they're going to be able to get up and go back to feed quicker, especially if you are doing that right at weaning time. They're already stressed out, but it will cut down a little bit on that. And studies have shown that they will go back and eat quicker than if they didn't have it.
Do we have any more questions in the chat box? Let's see this. Travis, this is Randy. I have a question for you. Maybe creep feeding those calves a few weeks before, like if you have a creep feeder, would that be beneficial for you to do in a weaned calf?
Yeah, the number one benefit of creep feeding is basically bunk breaking. And so, from an economic standpoint, creep feeding it's hard for it to be cost effective. from a cow-calf producer, but it's a very effective way of bonk breaking. And so those calves that have been crap fed, they come to a bonk much faster and get on feed much quicker than a calf that's never been on grape feed. And so that there's a big benefit from that standpoint. And you know, for those calves that you may be weaning out on pasture, that's where you see probably a little larger benefit of creep feeding, because you know they never get backed into a dry lot until they hit a feedlot. And so that they've already been broke out on pasture. And so, yeah, that's where your benefit will be with creep feeding, is that they'll come up and start eating earlier.
So Lindsay, have you ever looked at weaning across the fence, or Travis, either one, where they put the flapper over the nose where they can't nurse the cow, actually keeping them in with the cow?
I have not done that myself. I've never actually put them on in practice. I don't know if Travis, you've seen it done in research trials or.
Yeah, you know, it's fairly effective. The problem with nose flaps is you can't keep them in very long. But if you go to Argentina and talk to those guys, they actually leave them in there for months, and they actually early wean calves with nose flaps. And it seems to be a pretty effective way. Calves will learn how to flip that up and get underneath it, or some calves will. But yeah, I think it's a if you can bring them in and put the nose flaps in, it can be a low stress way to actually wean calves, or begin that process to wean calves. But you do have to bring them back through and put in that nose flap and then take it out a couple weeks later.
Lindsay, we have another question too. Does Coccidia have any impact on post-weaning health? And if so, what would your recommendations be pre and post-weaning?
So yes, Coccidia can definitely. Coccidia is a funny little bug, protozoa that it can show up when you're stressed too. So they can it can be there. It lives in the environment. You go through a stressful event and you're going to start to see clinical signs. And those can vary anywhere from just seeing a little bit of blood, in the manure, to even neurological signs where they're, head pressing or circling. So there's a lot of different things that can be there, and it can affect it during weaning. As far as treatment goes, there are different options that are available. Again, that's something you're going to want to talk to your veterinarian about, but there is, depending on your water source, you can do treatments through that. You can do feed through sources, but that's something that once you have that treatment plan with your veterinarian, you can get on top of it. The other thing is sometimes Coccidia is self-limiting. And what that means is sometimes you might see just a little bit of blood, but it doesn't really cause an issue. And again, some calves are going to be more affected than others. So that's why we usually do a whole lot treatment versus individuals, but work that out with your veterinarian and be aware that it is a possibility.
So Travis, we have another one. If weaning on pasture with creep feeding, what intake would you target?
Yeah, that's the intake is the problem with creep feeds, Brad, and so that's where it's not cost effective, because it's hard to control intake. And so, I would probably be somewhere in that 2 to 3 pound range if I can control costs, but that's the issue that you run into, is intakes are higher than you project, and you don't get enough gain from those intakes, so your cost of gains are too high to benefit. But I would try to be around 2 to 3 pounds of intake, or tri-minor intake of those calves. And to touch on the Coccidia deal, one thing I highly recommend to any calves that you're weaning or keeping is adding a feed additive or Rumensin. If you can add it, is highly beneficial of controlling or as limiting that as much as possible, especially if you're going to keep those on as yearlings or have a yearling program. That's a great method of helping control that and actually helping with some gains as well and feed efficiency of those calves.
If there's no other questions, we'll probably try to wrap this up. Lindsay or Travis, you have anything else to add?
No, not really. You know, preconditioning is one of those things that sometimes you sit down and it's hard to think it's going to pay for itself. But like Lindsay touched on, I think from just a management of a welfare issue, preconditioning should be added to all programs, just from the health aspect of those calves.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would add is sometimes it can be maybe a little overwhelming to think about the planning process and what you need, but definitely seek out, a trusted source. So, and that can be, your veterinarian, that can be us in extension, a neighbor, somebody that is doing well. So it's not something you have to take on yourself, but definitely just a little bit of planning will really pay off in the long run.
So key things would be planning, budget, making sure that you have feed for them that'll work. We also do ration analysis, both Travis and I do. And so those are kind of things you can work with extension. Thanks both of you guys for coming on. We want to thank everyone for joining us today. A recording of this webinar will be posted on cap.unl.edu, where you can also register for other upcoming webinars. The next one will be on early weaning next week, so it kind of fits with this one. Please click the link in the box here to take a brief survey to provide feedback on this webinar and inform our upcoming sessions, which will be early weaning next week. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Lindsay and Travis, for being on.